All right, welcome back to the channel. Today I am talking about applying the context fork front matter option to skill and slash command configurations that should execute in an isolated sub-agent context, preventing cross-contamination of session state. When you read that, you go, what the hell are they talking about? But in reality, this actually makes a whole lot of sense, and I'll explain in a minute. Now, this is, I believe, the fourth video in my series on Claude Code certification. I have, I think, four more to go after this one. And then I will probably take the exam again this coming week. And hopefully I have studied enough to actually pass it. So let's take a look at what this particular skill is all about, or this particular subdomain. So first and foremost, we know that Claude uses a context window to keep track of everything that we're doing. In that context window, we're including all of our chat history. We load different contents from the files that it's looking at, any kind of output that it received from various tools. Keep in mind that we might also have a CLAUDE.md file that defines some parameters and talks about the project itself. We might have some skills that are being loaded, and all of this is loaded into this shared resource we call the context. Now, it could be pretty big, but even a pretty big context, like 1,000,000 tokens, eventually starts to degrade. And so there are a couple of things that we encounter. We can lose track or get different results from skills depending on how full that context is. And we might degrade Claude's ability to respond to things if the context is too full. One of the ways that it deals with it is by compacting the context. And so some of the detail that we've collected might get lost, but if we don't compact it, then it may start to hallucinate more once it passes the 70 to 80% threshold for size. So there are two immediate problems that we're trying to solve. Problem number one is that if you run a long session with repeated skill use, you may notice that skills behave differently during that long session. So as an example, you might have a skill that reviews a piece of code, and you ask it to review this piece of code, and it comes back and says, well, this is maybe a medium problem. Now you keep talking to Claude for a while, and maybe an hour later you say, here, review this piece of code again. And it's exactly the same piece of code, and it's exactly the same skill. And now it comes back and says, well, you know what? That problem now is huge. It's no longer a medium, it's big. And so why did you get different output by asking Claude to run the same thing over and over again? And the difference is that the context itself has influenced the skill to give you a different answer than what you got before. Now, I guess that might be a good thing, but typically we want the same answer over and over again. And so we want to control what we share in that context along with that skill in order to not influence the skill itself. The second problem that we encounter, which is down here, is that multiple skills and files fill up the context itself and degrade its quality. So this is the 70 to 80%. If we fill up that context, Claude starts to hallucinate more when it gets to that 70 or 80% mark. So one of the known ways that it can reduce this is by compacting the history. But this, of course, reduces the detail level that we've collected in that chat history itself. So the solution, believe it or not, to both of these problems is to use something called context fork. And this allows us to specify that a skill or whatever it is that we're running should run under its own subagent, summarize whatever the return was, and pass that back to our original context. So this typically lives inside of skills or slash commands. And if you remember from the previous lesson, we talked a little bit about this. Your skill is really a combination of a front matter area, which is in the YAML formatting language, and then the rest of it is a markdown file, which describes the skill itself and how you want Claude to behave. So here we can add a context : fork to the front matter. This is in YAML, and this is like right on top of the file itself. So now the skill or the slash command is going to run in isolation. The skill content becomes the prompt that drives that subagent, and it won't have access to our master conversation history. So it's a fresh window and it's a new context, and the output summary is then collected by the subagent, created by the subagent, and returned back to our main conversation. So if you go back to problem number 1, right, one of the things we said is like I ran a skill first thing when I started my chat and it returned 1 response. I ran the same skill against the same file or files later on in my chat, and now the result is different. Well, if you run that in its own subagent every time, the result is not going to be identical, because this is not a system that is going to get you identical answers each and every time, but it should be close. So in other words, if your skill returns, I don't know, code debt value or complexity value, and it's like low, medium, or high, you should be consistently getting a medium. If that's what you got the first time, the second time should be a medium as well. Obviously, once in a hellish blue moon, it might come back and give you something different. But for the most part, running this against a clean context should give you the same answer each and every time. This also helps you solve problem number 2, because now we no longer have to degrade the quality of our responses with a full context, because skills and slash commands and other things may not necessarily get loaded into that upper level context. They're going to run on its own and only return summaries back, which we can handle much more of and for much longer than if we had all of this loaded into the main context. So when should you use this? And so there's a couple of specific cases when this makes sense, and a couple of cases where it doesn't really make sense. So first and foremost, if you're doing some heavy reading, and to Claude, heavy reads is anything more than 5 to 10 files, then you should let the subagent do that heavy lifting and return a summary. So in other words, the fork is used when we're reading multiple files, like maybe in a scenario where we use a code review or something like that. And if we're reading a lot of files, we're going to let a subagent handle that work. The second reason is problem number 1, which is a repeatable critical task. Here, we're essentially saying that we don't want our context window to influence each run of the skill or action. And so if we're running it at 8 a.m. and 11 a.m., as my example states, we want to make sure we get similar results. And so by outsourcing this to a subagent, using this context fork command allows us to do that. Last but not least, self-contained workflows. In other words, if we're doing something and it could care less about our main context and what we have loaded in there and how that works, there's zero reason for us to actually do that work inside of our main context window. Because again, I feel like this is becoming an art form, and this is something that we need to keep an eye on and make sure that we handle. Like, we can't let our context get too big. So when we're about to do something with Claude, we not only need to think about the code that we're writing or the thing that we're doing, but also how Claude will behave based on how we run this. And this is one of those things that really helps us get to the, or, help us work with Claude more efficiently and create less hallucinations and errors. So when you think about running a skill or a slash command or some sort of a task, and it's self-contained, it does not depend on anything that we're doing in our main context. It totally makes sense to run this as a fork. Now, when shouldn't you use a fork? And for that, we have a couple of cases. And the main one is guidelines. So if you're basically describing your architecture, describing how Claude should use certain components or do things that aren't really actionable, but more of a guide for Claude, that totally does not make sense to run in a self-contained agent. And that's because this information does not really go back up. Like the subagent will summarize it and return something back. But again, like a lot of detail is lost in that translation. So nothing that isn't actionable is forkable. The other item is tasks that do require your full conversation. We have plenty of those. We have plenty of those cases on the coding side, on the co-work side, and essentially anything that's looking up through your entire chat and trying to figure out what to do next based on what's already been done is important to not to use that forking convention. I don't know why, but this sounds wrong, but it's right. All right. So I do have some scenarios written out here that talk about the specifics of where you should incorporate this. And I will say, I guess from a test perspective, when you see context fork as a potential answer to a question, it's probably that choice. And I say that because out of the 7 or 8 cases that I have listed here that we're about to go through, there are 2 specific cases that essentially say don't fork. Everything else, for all of these cases, the answer is fork. So let's take a look. So scenario number 1 is that a Teams / code review skill produces consistent results in fresh sessions, but increasingly inconsistent results as a working session grows longer. So this is exactly problem number 1. There are no errors, and token usage is well under the limits, so we haven't hit any hard limits. So what configuration changes would you make here? And the answer is to fork that skill. So in other words, code review should be done in a subagent, and that subagent should return a summary back to our main conversation. This way, the code review skill is not influenced by anything that the context may have in it. So the key things here is well under limits. So in other words, if we would have said something like, oh, hey, we've hit our context window limit, then maybe one of the choices that you could pick here would be to compact the context. But in this particular case, we haven't hit any limits. We're doing fine. It's just not consistently being answered. And so context fork is the answer. Let's look at case number 2. So scenario number 2 says, after invoking a research skill that analyzes 60 files, and I would say that that's a keyword right there, 60 files, a developer notices the main session has lost track of earlier decisions and responses degrade. What should the skill configuration have included? And here the answer again is context fork, but it's for the other reason. In other words, we're now reading above that 5 to 10 file threshold. And so we're going to outsource the processing and reading and analyzing of those 60 files to the subagent, and we want a summary back. So this is the same fix. We're applying context fork, same as our first scenario, but the reason behind it is completely different, because the 60 files in this case would basically consume a lot of tokens out of our existing context. And if we're getting closer to that 80% threshold, or if we have stuff early on in this session that may get compacted, we may lose some reasoning capability that we still want to preserve and maintain. So context fork for anything above 10 files is recommended. And that's what I'm assuming the exam is going to test me on. Next up is when I run something in a fresh session, I get result X. When I run the same thing on the same context 20 minutes later, I get a different answer. So this is, again, because the session influences the skills work. And so by outsourcing it to a subagent, we reduce or eliminate that influence. And again, really the same, it's this almost the same scenario as 1 and 2, but we're reading 50 files, and those 50 files take up way too much resources on our initial or our main context, and so we need to reduce that somehow. Outsourcing it to a subagent fixes that problem. All right, let's look at number 4. And number 4 and number 5 in particular, when we are not using fork. And so here you could see, after adding context fork to an API convention skill, a team finds Claude no longer follows API conventions. So this wasn't an actionable skill. It's a skill that describes how we want to write our APIs. And so because of that, Claude is failing because it now doesn't get that description as part of its main context. For number 5, a developer invokes a forked fix issue skill after a long debugging discussion, and the skill asks for information that was discussed extensively in the session. So this is, and I should have selected, I guess, both the question and the answer, but here, what we're doing depends on our main context window. And so by outsourcing it to a subagent, we lose that context. And so that's why Claude is now asking for help, because it no longer knows how to answer this question, because the subagent does not have access to our main context. And what we get back from the subagent isn't enough detail for us to actually work on something. So that is the answer there. Then we have 6, 7, and 8. And all 3 of these scenarios rely on us outsourcing using context fork. So the first one, a session exceeds practical token limits during extended code base exploration. So we're loading all these files again into the code base. They're being loaded into the context. By using by forking these things and outsourcing them to a subagent, we prevent those token usages from hitting our main window or our main context. Next one is, a compliance team requires that an audit skill produce equivalent results regardless of when a session is invoked. Which front matter option satisfies this? So again, this is a play on number 1, which we said if we want a consistent answer out of Claude, we need to basically use context fork. And the last one is, again, a play on number 1. 20 minutes into a session where we talked about a security incident, developer runs a review on an unrelated UI code and receives heavy security focus review. Which phenomenon explains this? And this is basically a session contaminating the skill output. So this is the same as number one. So these are the types of scenarios that come up on the Claude certification exam. I now feel like I understand this pretty well. I think creating these videos has really helped me dial in those things that I guess I didn't really know for the exam initially. And by answering them this way and by talking about them, first of all, I really hope that it helps somebody out there who is thinking or planning on taking the Claude certification exam. But secondly, this also definitely helps me because talking through it like this is a big deal for me, and it makes it easy for me to understand this and actually remember it. Like, I mean, I will rewatch every one of these videos before I go take the test, which is probably next Friday. But in the meantime, thank you for watching. I will try to post the rest of those videos over the next 4 or 5 days, and that should get me pretty close to all of the topics that I got, or should complete all of the topics that I got a 0 in. And then if I have time, I'll also tackle the ones that I did poorly in, where I got like 50% or 67%. So we'll tackle all of them little by little. I then eventually, please comment below and let me know that this is something that interests you. I would like to do sessions like this across all of the topics of the Claude exam and cover every one of them so they're a little bit clearer. Now, of course, I'm kind of rambling at this point, and hopefully all of that will get better as I create more videos. I did just complete a 30-day camera challenge, which I think is helping as well. But anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and like and share if this is something that you like. It's the only way I know that anything I create is useful for somebody. Okay.